William Carter sat at his usual spot, a private lounge overlooking the city's glittering skyline. The Crystal Horizon Club was a fortress of exclusivity, towering over downtown Chicago's Gold Coast. It wasn't just a bar. It was a sanctuary for the elite, where deals worth millions were sealed over glasses of aged scotch, and where power was the unspoken currency. The air carried the scent of expensive cologne, Cuban cigars, and quiet ambition. Tonight was supposed to be another victory lap, another celebration of William's latest real estate conquest, a high-rise acquisition that had netted him another $100 million. But he wasn't celebrating. Surrounded by the usual mix of business moguls and models who barely knew how to spell investment portfolio, William felt nothing. The admiration, the envy, the power, it had all become numbingly predictable. He had spent years building his empire, crushing competitors, amassing wealth that most men would kill for. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt restless. Across the table, John Brooks, his oldest friend and the only person in the room who could read him like an open book, smirked as he swirled his whiskey. "You're bored," John said, watching him with amusement. William exhaled, leaning back against the leather seat. "We're sitting in a club where people pay $100,000 just for membership. There's a list of women in here who would kill to leave with me. And yet, yeah, I'm bored." John chuckled. The great William Carter, king of Chicago's skyline, tired of being on top. That's rich. William didn't respond. He just took another sip of his drink, letting the bitterness settle on his tongue. John's smirk widened. He had seen this coming. William had everything: money, status, power. But what he didn't have was a challenge. And for a man who had spent his entire life proving that he could have anything he wanted, that was dangerous. And so John did what he did best. He stirred the pot. "You know what your problem is?" John said, casually setting down his drink. "You've never done anything just because you couldn't." William arched a brow. "I don't follow." John leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "You've never walked into something knowing you might actually fail. You always stack the deck in your favor. Business, women, life. It's all a carefully controlled equation for you. But what if, for once, you put yourself in a position where you weren't the one in control?" William narrowed his eyes, his intrigue piqued. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" A slow, dangerous grin spread across John's face. "A bet," he said. William sighed. "John, no, listen," John cut him off. "A real challenge. Something that'll make you sweat. Something no amount of money or charm can fix." "And?" John leaned back, playing with the glass in his hand. "Marry someone completely outside your type. Someone you would never choose. Stay with her for 6 months. No prenup, no financial benefits. A real marriage." William scoffed. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" John challenged. "Or are you afraid?" William let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he reached for his drink. "You really think I'd waste 6 months of my life on a joke?" John smirked. "It's not a joke if you're too scared to take it." William's grip on his glass tightened slightly, though he didn't immediately react. John had always known how to get under his skin, how to push him past his limits. They had grown up together, side by side, in the same world of power, wealth, and ruthless ambition. But while William had built a real estate empire, John had built something else entirely: a reputation for being the man who could manipulate anyone into doing exactly what he wanted. William wasn't easily provoked, but John was right about one thing. He had never walked into anything without knowing he would win. He calculated every move, every risk. And a marriage? That was one battlefield he had no interest in playing on. Still, John saw the hesitation, and he went in for the kill. "You're predictable, Will," he continued smoothly. "Always dating the same type of women. Models, heiresses, women who want you for what you can offer. You go to the same clubs, drink the same overpriced whiskey, seal the same business deals. But deep down, you're bored. You just won't admit it." William exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw as he stared out at the city skyline. The truth was, there was nothing left to chase anymore. He had climbed to the top, and now he was just there. John leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. "So here's the deal. You marry someone completely opposite of everything you've ever wanted. Someone who wouldn't take your money, wouldn't want your world, wouldn't fall at your feet like the others." He paused, watching William's expression shift ever so slightly. "You marry her for 6 months. No prenup, no safety net. Just you and her. In a real marriage." William scoffed. "And where exactly do you expect me to find this perfectly unsuitable woman?" John's grin widened. "Oh, don't worry. I've already got the perfect candidate." A strange feeling settled in William's chest. He knew that look in John's eyes. It meant trouble. "Eva Bennett," John said smoothly. The name hit William like a bucket of ice water. His eyes flicked back to John, searching for any sign that he was joking. But John looked dead serious. "Eva," William repeated slowly. "As in your sister?" John raised his glass. "That's the one." William almost laughed. Almost. But instead he leaned back, his mind immediately pulling up the few pieces of information he knew about her. Eva Bennett wasn't just some random woman. She was a problem. A woman who had made a career out of opposing everything he stood for. A professor at the University of Chicago, known for her sharp intellect, her unyielding stance on corporate greed, and her relentless efforts to fight against the kind of gentrification that made men like William richer. She had spoken at protests against his projects, had called him out in public interviews, had stood on podiums and denounced people like him as parasites. And if that wasn't enough, she was nothing like the women he dated. She was blunt, practical, not the type to chase designer labels or worry about looking perfect at charity galas. He doubted she even owned a dress that cost more than a few $100s. "She despises me," William said flatly. John laughed. "Exactly. That's what makes this interesting." William shook his head. "She would never agree to it." John took a slow sip of his whiskey before setting the glass down with a soft clink. "She might." William arched a brow. "And why the hell would she do that?" John smirked, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who knew exactly how to play the game. "Because you're going to make her an offer she can't ignore." Something about the way John said it made William pause. He didn't like where this was going, but at the same time he couldn't look away. John leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice dropping just enough to make it feel like they were the only two people in the room. "You think I don't know what she's been fighting for? She spent years trying to get funding for low-income housing projects, trying to save neighborhoods from developers like you. And guess what? She's losing. Every damn time." William exhaled, now fully invested in what John was saying. John continued, his tone slow and deliberate. "But what if, for once, she could win? What if someone suddenly decided to fund her biggest project? Back it, no strings attached. Give her exactly what she's been fighting for all these years?" William stared at John, reading between the lines. You think I should pay her to marry me? He asked dryly. John smirked. Not pay her. Just give her something she already wants. Something that would change everything for her. William didn't answer immediately. He could already see the pieces moving, the way it would play out. If he went to Ava and proposed marriage, she'd slam the door in his face. But if he dangled the right incentive, that was a different story. His pulse ticked slightly as he considered it. The idea was reckless, stupid. He had no interest in marriage, no desire to waste 6 months of his life pretending to be something he wasn't. But at the same time, something about it sparked a challenge in him. He had spent years winning every battle, every deal, every negotiation. But could he win over someone like Ava? Slowly, William set down his drink, meeting John's gaze. You're an asshole, he muttered. John grinned. I know. There was a long pause before William exhaled deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. Fine, he said. Let's see if she takes the bait. John laughed, raising his glass in a mock toast. Now that's the William Carter I know. And just like that, the bet was set. One way or another, William was about to walk into a game where for the first time in his life, he might not be the one in control. Eva Bennett's day had started like any other. Early morning lectures, back-to-back meetings with faculty, and an endless stream of emails about funding proposals for affordable housing projects. The University of Chicago campus was buzzing with students, but she barely noticed. She had bigger concerns than grading papers or department politics. A community she'd been fighting for was on the verge of being swallowed up by corporate developers, and the city council wasn't listening. She was used to this fight, used to standing in front of bureaucrats who saw people as numbers, neighborhoods as real estate opportunities, used to the exhaustion of rallying support, of watching projects she poured her heart into get crushed under the weight of men in suits with billion-dollar agendas. And there was no one who embodied that world more than William Carter. Just thinking about his name made her blood pressure rise. William was a symbol of everything wrong with Chicago's corporate elite. Powerful, untouchable, ruthless in his pursuit of profit. His projects had displaced thousands under the guise of urban renewal, driving property values up while pushing lower-income families out. He was a walking contradiction, praised by the business world while condemned by activists like her. The only reason she hadn't gone head-to-head with him personally was because he'd never cared enough to acknowledge her fights. Until today. Eva had just stepped out of her office when she spotted a sleek black car parked outside the faculty building, its tinted windows reflecting the midday sun. She wouldn't have thought twice about it, except for the man standing next to it, casually leaning against the door like he owned the world. Her stomach tightened. William Carter. For a split second, she thought she was imagining things. What the hell was he doing here? He looked out of place against the backdrop of students hurrying between classes, his designer suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the casual academic setting. He had his hands in his pockets, looking completely unbothered, like showing up unannounced at a university campus was a normal part of his day. He noticed her instantly, pushing off the car with that infuriating air of confidence she despised. Professor Bennett. His voice was smooth, unreadable. Ava folded her arms, planting her feet firmly on the pavement. Carter. She made no attempt to hide her irritation. I'd ask what you're doing here, but I doubt I'd like the answer. William smirked, unfazed by the hostility in her tone. I need a few minutes of your time. I'm busy. I figured you'd say that. He glanced around at the students passing by, then gestured toward the car. "Get in." Eva let out a short laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You think I'm just going to drop everything and get into a car with you?" William's expression didn't change, but there was something in his gaze, something calculating. "I think you're going to want to hear what I have to say." She stared at him, searching for some clue as to what game he was playing, but curiosity won out over annoyance. With a sigh, she stepped forward and opened the car door. William slid in beside her as the driver pulled away from the curb, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. The interior of the car was exactly what she expected: sleek, expensive, and completely impersonal, much like the man sitting beside her. Dark leather seats, tinted windows, a faint scent of something sharp and refined, probably whatever cologne billionaires bathed in. William sat comfortably, one arm resting on the seat, exuding the kind of unshakable confidence that made her want to throw him out of his own car. Eva crossed her arms, making it clear she wasn't in the mood for whatever he was about to propose. "You've got 5 minutes, Carter. Make it count." William turned slightly, his gaze meeting hers, unreadable but sharp. "All right," he said smoothly. "I want to make you a deal." Eva arched a brow. "A deal?" "You've spent years fighting for low-income housing in Chicago. The city council barely listens, funding gets cut, and every time you think you've made progress, someone like me comes along and wipes it out with another high-rise." His tone was almost conversational, but there was a knowing edge to it. He wasn't just talking about any developer. He was talking about himself. Ava's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Glad to see you're self-aware. What's your point?" William exhaled, his fingers tapping against the seat in a slow rhythm. "I want to fund your next project." For a second, she thought she'd misheard him. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'm offering full funding, no strings attached. Whatever it takes to get your latest community housing development off the ground. No bureaucracy, no months of red tape. Just the money, straight into your hands." Ava stared at him, waiting for the catch. Because there was always a catch, especially with a man like William Carter. She narrowed her eyes, and in return, his lips curved slightly like he'd been waiting for that question. "You marry me." Silence. For the first time since stepping into the car, Eva was at a loss for words. She had expected many things when William Carter showed up at her university. Maybe a veiled legal threat. Maybe an attempt to buy her silence on some project he was working on. But this was so far beyond anything she could have imagined that for a brief, absurd moment, she actually thought he was joking. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "You've lost your mind." William didn't react. He simply watched her, waiting for the disbelief to settle. Eva shook her head, running a hand through her hair. "You're serious. Dead serious." She stared at him like he'd just grown another head. "Why?" He tilted his head slightly. "Does it matter?" "Oh, it matters," she shot back. "Because the last time I checked, you were one of the most eligible bachelors in the country. You could have literally anyone, so why me?" William leaned in slightly, his voice quieter, more deliberate. "Because you're the opposite of everything I know." Something about the way he said it made the air in the car feel heavier. Ava clenched her fists, trying to suppress the unease creeping into her chest. She wasn't naive. She knew men like William didn't do things out of the goodness of their hearts. There was always an angle, always a strategy. "I'm supposed to believe that out of all the women in Chicago, you suddenly decided I was wife material?" she asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. He smirked. "Number, you're a challenge." Eva's jaw clenched. She hated the way he said that. Hated the way it made her feel like she was part of some game he was playing. "You're out of your damn mind if you think I'm going to agree to this." She reached for the door handle, fully prepared to get out at the next stoplight. William sighed, then casually threw out the one thing that made her freeze. "If you say no, the community center in South Loop gets bulldozed next month." Eva's fingers stopped inches from the handle. Her entire body went still. Slowly, she turned back to him, her expression shifting from disbelief to cold fury. "You wouldn't." William met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no smirk, no arrogance, just cold, hard certainty. "I would." Her heart pounded as the weight of his words sank in. The South Loop Community Center was a lifeline for hundreds of families. It wasn't just a building. It was after-school programs, childcare for single parents, job training for people trying to rebuild their lives. And William Carter had the power to wipe it off the map with a single phone call. He wouldn't actually do it. Would he? She studied his face, looking for any sign that this was just a bluff. But there was nothing. No hesitation. No guilt. Just an offer she couldn't refuse. 6 months, he said quietly. "That's all I need." Eva's pulse thundered in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away, to tell him exactly where he could shove his proposal. But if she did, she wouldn't be the only one paying the price. Her stomach twisted. She had spent years fighting against men like William. Now she was about to make a deal with the devil himself. Eva swallowed hard. Then, against everything she stood for, everything she believed in, she looked him dead in the eye and said, "Fine, I'll marry you." The legal office of Carter and Associates was an imposing structure in the heart of downtown Chicago. Glass walls, polished marble floors, an atmosphere thick with efficiency and power. It was the kind of place where million-dollar deals were signed without hesitation, where contracts dictated the fate of entire city blocks. And today, it was where Eva Bennett was about to sign away 6 months of her life. She sat at the long conference table, arms crossed, her expression set in stone-cold indifference as the documents were placed in front of her. Across from her, William Carter was the picture of ease, impeccably dressed, calm, completely unbothered. If this arrangement had any effect on him at all, he wasn't showing it. Eva clenched her jaw as she skimmed the contract. The terms were exactly what they had agreed upon. 6 months of marriage. No financial entanglements. No actual relationship. Just a legal binding that would make her Mrs. William Carter in the eyes of the world. In return, her nonprofit's biggest project, the South Loop Community Initiative, would receive full, unrestricted funding. No loopholes, no bureaucratic delays. It was a deal with the devil, and she was about to sign in blood. Beside William, his personal attorney, Jonathan Klein, cleared his throat. "Ms. Bennett, as per our discussion, the contract stipulates that you and Mr. Carter will maintain a legal marriage for 6 months. You will make occasional public appearances together as a couple. But beyond that, your personal lives will remain separate. Upon completion of the agreement, both parties will be free to file for an annulment or divorce." Eva nodded sharply. "And if he backs out before 6 months?" Jonathan barely blinked. "Then you still keep the funding." That, at least, was some comfort. Not that she trusted William, but if he decided this game wasn't worth playing anymore, at least the community she fought for wouldn't suffer. She picked up the pen, rolling it between her fingers as she studied the man across from her. William Carter, billionaire, real estate mogul, and now her husband-to-be. His gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. Something wrong? Eva exhaled slowly. Just wondering how many other women you've put under contract. A smirk flickered across his lips. Only the special ones. She resisted the urge to throw the pen at him. Instead, with one last deep breath, she signed her name in sharp, bold strokes. Jonathan slid the documents toward William. Without hesitation, he signed as well, sealing the arrangement. It was done. "Congratulations," Jonathan said, his voice neutral. "You're officially engaged." Eva set the pen down, her fingers curling into a fist beneath the table. What the hell had she just agreed to? The engagement was official. The ink on the contract was still drying when William leaned back in his chair, looking completely at ease, while Eva felt like she'd just signed away her sanity. Jonathan gathered the documents into a neat stack, sliding them into his leather briefcase as if this was just another routine transaction. In William's world, that's exactly what it was. Eva exhaled sharply and stood, pushing her chair back with a little more force than necessary. "When's the wedding?" she asked flatly, wanting to get this over with. William checked his watch, as if he had a full schedule of billion-dollar meetings and was trying to slot her in. "Saturday." Eva's brows shot up. "You're kidding." "Not at all." He stood as well, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit with a casualness that made her want to slap the smug right off his face. "It's just a legal formality. No need to drag it out." "You say that like marriage is an errand on your to-do list." He smirked. "For me, it is." She gritted her teeth, reminding herself, 6 months. Just 6 months. And after that, she would be free, her project would be secured, and she could go back to pretending men like William Carter didn't exist. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at it briefly before sliding it back into his pocket. "I have meetings. My assistant will send over the details. Venue, logistics, anything you need to know." He started toward the door, then stopped, looking over his shoulder at her. "Oh, and Eva?" She crossed her arms. "What now?" "You might want to buy a dress," he said smoothly. "Something that won't make the press think I dragged you out of a lecture hall." Her nostrils flared. "Oh, don't worry, Carter. I'll make sure to look the part of your perfect little trophy wife." His smirk deepened. "I don't need perfect, just convincing." And with that, he was gone, leaving her standing there, seething. 2 days later, Eva found herself standing in a high-end boutique on Michigan Avenue, staring at a row of white dresses that cost more than her entire annual salary. "This is insane," she muttered, rubbing her temples. "I agree," Maggie said beside her, flipping through the racks with mild curiosity. "But hey, at least if you're going to sell your soul, you'll do it in couture." Eva shot her a glare. "Not helping." Maggie grinned. "Come on, you have to find the humor in this. You, of all people, getting married to William Carter. If someone had told me last year that you'd be wearing a wedding dress and saying 'I do' to the literal embodiment of corporate greed, I would have assumed you were in a hostage situation." Eva groaned. "I might as well be." Maggie held up a sleek, off-the-shoulder gown. "Try this one. It screams reluctant but stunning bride." Eva sighed but took the dress, disappearing into the fitting room. This was happening. In 48 hours, she would be Mrs. William Carter. She was marrying a man she hated. And worse, the part of her that scared her the most, the part she refused to acknowledge, was the fact that he didn't seem to hate her at all. The wedding was nothing like Ava had imagined. Not that she had ever imagined getting married in the first place, and definitely not to a man like William Carter. There was no grand cathedral, no sentimental vows, no teary-eyed guests watching two souls unite for love, because there was no love. Instead, there was a lavish, perfectly staged event held at one of Chicago's most exclusive venues, designed not for romance, but for optics. The guest list was composed of business elites, media moguls, and politicians, all gathered to witness the union of a man who controlled half the city's real estate and a woman who, up until last week, had been one of his loudest critics. Eva stood in front of the mirror in a stunning off-the-shoulder ivory gown, her hair styled in soft waves, makeup flawless. She barely recognized herself. Maggie stood behind her, arms crossed, studying her reflection with a critical eye. "You look like a woman about to marry for money," she muttered. Eva let out a dry laugh. "Technically I am. Just not for myself." Maggie's expression softened. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Eva met her own gaze in the mirror, forcing herself to breathe. 6 months. Just 6 months. And in exchange, she would secure the funding that could change hundreds of lives. She could survive this. So, she nodded. "Let's get this over with." The ceremony was held in a glass-walled ballroom overlooking the Chicago skyline, a masterpiece of modern elegance. White roses lined the aisle, chandeliers cast a golden glow, and the press had been carefully positioned to capture the perfect shots of the city's most powerful man taking a wife. William stood at the altar in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, looking as composed as ever. He watched her as she walked down the aisle, his expression unreadable, his posture effortless. To anyone else, he looked like a groom waiting for his bride. To Ava, he looked like a man who had just sealed another business deal. When she reached him, he extended his hand. She hesitated for half a second before placing her fingers in his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the quiet strength of his grip. The officiant began speaking, reciting the script that neither of them had written, words that neither of them believed in. Eva barely heard any of it. She kept her chin lifted, shoulders squared, repeating her vows with the same calm detachment William used when signing multi-million-dollar contracts. Then came the part she had been dreading. "You may kiss the bride." Eva's breath hitched. A flicker of something unreadable crossed William's eyes before he leaned in, and in front of hundreds of flashing cameras, he kissed her. The moment William's lips touched hers, Ava felt a jolt of awareness rush through her. It was precisely calculated, like everything else about him, just long enough to appear genuine, just firm enough to look convincing, yet completely impersonal. It was a performance and a damn good one. The cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing what the world would believe was the beginning of a perfect marriage. But Ava knew better. When he pulled away, his gaze locked onto hers for a fraction of a second, steady, assessing. Then, just as quickly, he turned to face the guests, leading her down the aisle as the applause filled the ballroom. She barely noticed the extravagant reception that followed. The toasts, the speeches, the staged laughter. It was all part of the illusion. She played her role well, smiling at the right moments, letting William's hand rest lightly on her back as they moved through the crowd. But every now and then, when no one was looking, she felt his eyes on her. Not in a way that was affectionate or even possessive. It was something else, like he was studying her, waiting for something. She had no idea what. 2 hours in, she needed a break. Slipping away from the ballroom, she stepped onto the terrace, inhaling the crisp Chicago night air. The city stretched out before her, towering skyscrapers glittering against the dark sky. The sound of footsteps behind her told her she wasn't alone. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. "You disappeared." William's voice was smooth, unreadable. Eva kept her gaze on the skyline. "I needed air." He stepped beside her, hands in his pockets. "Regretting your decision already?" She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "I don't regret it, but that doesn't mean I have to enjoy it." William studied her for a long moment. "You did well tonight." She turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing. That almost sounded like a compliment. He smirked. "It was. You played your part perfectly." Her stomach twisted. That's what this was. A part to play. No matter how real it looked to the outside world, this wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction, a deal, a game they were both stuck in for 6 months. And yet, as much as she hated to admit it, William Carter was a man who intrigued her. He wasn't the careless playboy she had assumed. He was calculated, composed, always 3 steps ahead. And that meant one thing. She needed to be even more careful. Hours later, as she stepped into their shared penthouse for the first time, reality finally hit her. This was real. For the next 6 months, this was her life. And for the first time since signing that contract, Eva wondered if she had underestimated the price of this deal. The penthouse was exactly what she expected. Cold, modern, and absurdly expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the living room, offering a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline. Everything inside was minimalist, sleek, perfectly curated, like a showroom designed for someone who valued aesthetics over comfort. Eva had barely stepped inside when William walked past her, tossing his suit jacket onto a chair. He loosened his tie, rolling up his sleeves with the kind of effortless confidence that made her grit her teeth. "This place is bigger than I expected," she muttered, glancing around at the open concept space, the marble countertops, the perfectly arranged furniture that looked like no one had ever actually used it. William smirked, undoing the top button of his shirt. "I'd offer you a tour, but I assume you're not interested." "Not particularly." She dropped her purse on the nearest surface and turned to face him, arms crossed. "Let's get something straight. Just because we're living under the same roof doesn't mean we're going to be playing house." His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of amusement in his gaze. "Good. That makes 2 of us." A tense silence stretched between them. She hated how comfortable he looked. Like this arrangement meant nothing to him. Like he could do this for 6 months, a year, an entire lifetime, and walk away without a scratch. "Separate rooms?" she asked, breaking the silence. He arched a brow, as if the question was almost offensive. "Obviously." Relief washed over her, though she didn't show it. "Good. Then this should be easy." William leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You think so?" Eva narrowed her eyes. "I know so. I have no intention of getting in your way, and I expect the same courtesy from you. I don't need to know what you do or who you do it with. This is a business arrangement, nothing more." Something in his expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Curiosity, maybe? "You're really that detached about it?" he asked. Eva tilted her head. "Aren't you?" For a second, he just looked at her, like he was assessing something. Then he smirked. "Fair enough." She turned on her heel, heading for the hallway. "Great. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to start pretending you don't exist." His chuckle followed her down the hall. "Good luck with that, sweetheart." She slammed the bedroom door behind her. Ava exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers against her temples. This was her life now. 6 months of this. She could do it. She had to. Eva paced the length of her new bedroom, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The room itself was just as luxurious and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse. Modern furniture, neutral tones, expensive artwork on the walls. It was beautiful, sure, but it didn't feel lived in. Nothing about this place did. She kicked off her heels, running a hand through her hair as she sat on the edge of the massive bed. This was real. The wedding, the contract, the cameras flashing as she kissed William in front of the world. It all actually happened. She had married a man she despised, and now she had to coexist with him under the same roof for the next 6 months. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She didn't bother standing up. What? The door opened anyway, and William leaned against the frame, looking as relaxed and infuriatingly smug as ever. He had changed into a plain white shirt and dark slacks, but even in something that casual, he still carried himself like he owned everything and everyone around him. "Comfortable?" he asked. She shot him a withering glare. "What do you want?" William stepped inside, ignoring the tension rolling off her in waves. "Just thought I'd check in. You looked a little on edge earlier." Eva let out a short, humorless laugh. "Gee, I wonder why." His lips quirked slightly. "You're the one who agreed to this." She crossed her arms. "You gave me no choice." His smirk faded just a little, and for a moment, something unreadable flickered across his face. But then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. "You always have a choice, Ava," he said smoothly. "You just didn't like the alternative." Her jaw clenched, but she refused to take the bait. "Is that all? Or do you actually have a reason for being here?" He exhaled, looking at her as if debating whether to say something. Then he slid a sleek black envelope from his pocket and tossed it onto the bed beside her. Eva glanced down at it, but didn't move. "What's this?" "Your schedule for the next few weeks." She frowned. "Schedule?" William nodded. "Public appearances, interviews, charity events, the usual things a billionaire's wife is expected to do." Eva stared at him, barely able to contain the wave of irritation rising in her chest. "We agreed on occasional appearances, not that I'd suddenly become your full-time PR prop." William smirked. "Occasional is a flexible term." Her fingers curled into fists. "I have a job, a life. You don't get to dictate how I spend my time." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You're my wife now. Whether you like it or not, you have a role to play. The world is watching, Ava." She exhaled sharply, pushing the envelope off her lap and onto the bed. "I hate you." His smirk widened. "You'll survive?" With that, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Eva glared at the envelope like it personally offended her. 6 months. Just 6 months. And yet, as she stared at the schedule filled with carefully curated appearances, she had a sinking feeling that William Carter had no intention of making this easy for her. Eva adjusted the neckline of her dress for the 3rd time, scowling at her reflection in the mirror. The deep emerald gown was elegant, perfectly tailored, and entirely too expensive for her taste. The silk clung in all the right places, the fabric sweeping effortlessly down to the floor, making her look every bit the part of a billionaire's wife. She hated it. She hated the entire event before it even started. The Carter Foundation Annual Gala was one of the most anticipated high society events in Chicago. an exclusive gathering where the city's most powerful individuals rubbed elbows, made business deals disguised as philanthropy, and indulged in an evening of luxury under the guise of giving back. It was exactly the kind of hypocrisy Eva had spent her entire career fighting against. A knock sounded at her bedroom door before it pushed open without waiting for permission. William stood there in a tailored black tuxedo, as effortlessly composed as ever. The man wore power like a second skin, his presence filling the doorway as his sharp gaze swept over her. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered, an almost imperceptible shift as he took in the sight of her. Eva folded her arms. "If you're here to tell me I look the part, don't bother." William smirked. "I was going to say you clean up nicely, but if you insist." She rolled her eyes, grabbing the clutch that had been hand-selected by his assistant. "Let's just get this over with." William extended a hand toward her, a perfectly practiced motion, meant for the cameras waiting downstairs. "Smile, Mrs. Carter." She ignored his hand. Not a chance. His smirk widened, but he didn't push. Instead, he turned and led the way, and she followed, because that's what this was, a game, a performance. And tonight, she was stepping onto his stage. The ballroom was a masterpiece of extravagance, glittering chandeliers casting golden light over the sea of designer gowns and custom-tailored suits. Guests sipped on champagne that cost more than most people's rent, discussing mergers and stock portfolios like they were casual dinner topics. Eva hated every second of it. William navigated the crowd with ease, exchanging smirks and firm handshakes with men who looked just like him, powerful, wealthy, untouchable. She had barely taken a sip of her drink when she heard her own name from across the room. "Eva Bennett, isn't it?" She turned, coming face to face with James Wallace. And just like that, she knew this night was about to get a lot worse. James Wallace was exactly as Eva remembered from the few times she had seen him in televised business panels. Polished, predatory, and utterly condescending. His salt-and-pepper hair was neatly combed back, his expensive tuxedo worn with the ease of a man who had never worried about anything a day in his life. He extended a hand, his smile all charm, no sincerity. "I've been wanting to meet the woman who managed to tie down William Carter." Eva didn't take his hand. Instead, she offered him a tight, polite smile. "Funny, I wasn't aware anyone had tied anyone down." James let out a low chuckle, unfazed by the rejection. "Ah, of course. The independent type. William always did have a thing for a challenge." He turned slightly, his eyes gleaming with amusement as he glanced at William, who stood completely composed beside her. "Tell me, Will, how does it feel being a married man?" William didn't hesitate. "No different than being a single one," he said smoothly. Eva's fingers curled around her glass, barely resisting the urge to elbow him in the ribs. James laughed, swirling the whiskey in his hand. "I suppose we'll see how long that lasts." Then his attention shifted back to her, the amusement in his gaze sharpening into something colder. "I must admit, I was surprised when I heard the news. A professor? A social activist?" His smile was edged with condescension. Not exactly the usual Carter bride. Eva held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. And yet, here I am. James's smirk deepened, but before he could speak, William casually draped an arm around her waist. The touch was light, practiced, but the message was clear, a silent warning. "Ava's full of surprises," William said. His tone was easy, but there was an underlying edge to it. a subtle reminder that James was treading dangerous ground. James held William's stare for a long moment, before finally letting out a low chuckle. "I imagine she is." He took a sip of his drink, then glanced over his shoulder as a new guest arrived. "If you'll excuse me, I have a few people I need to speak with." He gave Ava one last, lingering look. "I'll be keeping a close eye on your work, Professor Bennett. Welcome to the family." Eva waited until he was out of earshot before turning toward William. What the hell was that? William removed his hand from her waist, as if he had barely noticed it was there in the first place. That was James Wallace being James Wallace. She scowled. "He doesn't like me. He doesn't like anyone who isn't making him money." Ava exhaled, still feeling the weight of James's words. "I don't trust him." William's lips quirked slightly. "Good. You shouldn't." She studied him for a second, debating whether to press further. But before she could, another group of socialites descended on them, eager to fawn over the city's new power couple. And just like that, the conversation ended. Hours later, when the gala had finally drawn to a close, they arrived back at the penthouse in silence. Ava kicked off her heels the moment she stepped inside, sighing in relief. "If I never have to do that again, it'll be too soon." William smirked as he loosened his tie. "You'll get used to it." She shot him a glare. "That's what I'm afraid of." He chuckled, stepping toward the bar and pouring himself a drink. "You handled yourself well tonight, even with James." Eva crossed her arms. "Why do I get the feeling that wasn't just a casual conversation?" William didn't immediately answer. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, then set the glass down, watching her carefully. "James isn't just another executive. He's powerful, ruthless, and he doesn't like unknown variables." She frowned. "And I'm an unknown variable? To him?" "Yes." William leaned against the counter, his gaze unreadable. "He's going to test you, Eva. He's going to watch your every move, waiting for the moment you slip." Eva exhaled slowly, processing that. "And what about you?" William's lips quirked slightly. "What about me? Are you watching me too?" For the first time that night, something in his expression shifted. Something flickered in his eyes, too quick for her to catch. Then he smirked. "Always." The air between them changed, thickened. Eva wasn't sure who moved first, but for a single moment, she felt the weight of his gaze, the tension between them palpable. Then, just as quickly, she turned away. "Good night, William." Without waiting for a response, she disappeared into her bedroom, shutting the door behind her. On the other side, William let out a quiet exhale, finishing his drink before muttering, "Good night." Mrs. Carter Ava had spent years digging into corporate corruption, exposing loopholes, and challenging the system. It was second nature to her. But now, sitting in the office of the Carter Foundation, sifting through financial reports and internal documents, she wasn't just investigating another faceless corporation. She was investigating her husband's empire. The thought made her stomach tighten, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't about him. This was about facts. About the numbers that didn't quite add up. The development projects that seemed too aggressive. The real estate acquisitions that didn't make sense. She had started looking into Carter Industries' expansion plans after her encounter with James Wallace at the gala. His words had stuck with her, the way he had carefully chosen to call her an unknown variable. It hadn't been an idle comment. It had been a warning. And if there was one thing she knew about men like James Wallace, it was that they didn't waste words. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she cross-checked property acquisitions with displacement reports. She wasn't surprised when she saw what she had feared: entire neighborhoods purchased under different subsidiary names, businesses forced to relocate, rent prices skyrocketing in areas where Carter Industries had stakes. It was the same pattern of gentrification she had fought against for years. But there was something else. Her eyes narrowed as she came across a recent purchase: a seemingly insignificant block of commercial properties in South Loop, buried under a shell company name. It didn't fit Carter Industries' usual investment strategy. Too small, too unprofitable for a high-level real estate mogul like William to care about. Unless it wasn't about the money. A cold sensation settled in her chest. She clicked deeper into the file, pulling up the details. That block housed several long-standing businesses and one major community center. Her community center. The one she had fought to save. The one William had promised was safe. Her pulse quickened as she double-checked the transaction date. It had been signed days before their wedding, before she had even agreed to marry him. Her breath caught. He had known. He had already been in the process of buying it out, even while pretending to negotiate. Her hands curled into fists as she stared at the evidence in front of her. William Carter had never intended to help her cause. He had been planning to take control of it from the start. She felt a burning mix of betrayal and fury rise in her chest. She had thought she had played this game on her own terms, that she had outmaneuvered him. But all along, he had been playing her. Ava slammed her laptop shut, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Fury surged through her, hot and relentless. She had known this arrangement was nothing more than a transaction, a calculated move on both their parts, but she had foolishly believed that, at the very least, William had been upfront about it. That his interest in funding her project had been part of their deal, not part of his strategy to control it. She should have known better. Without thinking, she pushed back from the desk and stormed out of the office, her heels echoing against the sleek marble floors. She didn't care if she caused a scene. Didn't care if anyone saw the rage burning in her eyes as she made her way to William's private office. His assistant barely had time to look up before Ava threw the door open, stepping inside without knocking. William sat behind his massive desk, phone in one hand, flipping through a contract with the other. He looked completely unbothered, as if he hadn't just been caught in a calculated betrayal. He barely glanced up. "Ava!" Her blood boiled at the ease in his voice. "You son of a—" She slammed a file onto his desk, cutting herself off before the words left her mouth. "Tell me, William, was this your plan from the start? Buy out my project and pretend to be my savior?" William finally looked up, arching a brow as he set his phone down. His expression was annoyingly unreadable. "I assume you're referring to South Loop." Eva's nails dug into her palms. "Don't play dumb. You bought it before the wedding, before I even agreed to this arrangement." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "You lied to me." His gaze didn't waver. "I never lied." She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, so you just conveniently forgot to mention that you already owned the one thing I was fighting for?" William exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I was securing my interests." Her stomach twisted at the cold, detached way he said it. "Your interests? That community center isn't some high-rise or a luxury shopping district. It's people's lives. But that doesn't matter to you, does it? As long as you're in control." He didn't deny it, didn't even flinch. Instead, he stood up, moving toward her with slow, measured steps. You're angry because you think I took your choices away, he said, voice calm. But let me ask you this. If I hadn't stepped in, how long do you think it would have taken for your project to collapse? A year? 6 months? Government funding is unreliable, Ava. You know that better than anyone. She clenched her jaw. That wasn't your decision to make. No, he agreed, his eyes locking onto hers. But it was the right one. Her hands shook with frustration. The worst part was that somewhere, buried under all her rage, a small part of her knew he was right. That the system was built against people like her. That she had spent years fighting a losing battle. But that didn't mean he had the right to take over her cause like he owned it. I don't need your help, she bit out. William's lips curved slightly, but there was no amusement in it. Then tell me, Professor Bennett, what exactly are you going to do? Walk away? Watch the project fall apart? Or do you want to see it succeed? Ava felt the walls closing in, the trap tightening around her. This wasn't a battle she could win, not without destroying everything she had worked for, and he knew it. She hated him. Hated that he was always one step ahead, always in control. Hated that he had turned her own fight into something he could use against her. But most of all, she hated that a part of her wasn't just furious. It was afraid. Because if she wasn't careful, she wasn't just going to lose this battle. She was going to lose herself to the game he was playing. Without another word, she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. William watched her go, exhaling slowly as he reached for his drink. He had expected this moment to come, had known Ava would eventually put the pieces together. She thought she hated him now. She had no idea how much worse this was going to get. Eva paced the length of her office, her mind racing. The confrontation with William had left her shaken, furious, and, if she was being honest, uneasy. She had spent years fighting against the kind of corporate manipulation he embodied. And yet, here she was, entangled in a battle she hadn't even seen coming. She should have known, should have expected this. William Carter didn't do charity. He didn't give away power. Everything he did had a purpose, a strategy. And now, he had positioned himself as the one holding all the cards. She clenched her jaw, pulling up the financial reports on her screen again. South Loop was no longer just a project she was fighting for. It was a power play, one she was losing. If she walked away now, she wouldn't just be abandoning the community she had promised to protect. She would be handing William an easy win, and she refused to let that happen. A sharp knock at her door snapped her out of her thoughts. Before she could respond, the door swung open, and Alice Carter stepped inside, her expression unreadable. Ava stiffened. She and Alice had barely interacted since the wedding. William's younger sister had been civil but distant, as if watching from the sidelines, waiting to see how long Ava would last in her brother's world. Ava folded her arms. Let me guess. You're here to tell me I'm overreacting. Alice smirked, closing the door behind her. Number, I'm here to tell you that my brother is a controlling bastard, and you should be careful. Eva blinked. That was unexpected. Alice walked over, crossing her arms as she leaned against the desk. I knew something was up when he announced he was getting married. William doesn't do anything unless it benefits him. Her gaze sharpened. And yet, here you are, looking ready to tear him apart. Ava exhaled slowly. He bought my project before I even agreed to marry him. He never intended to help me. He just wanted control. Alice didn't look surprised. That sounds like him. Eva studied her carefully. Why are you telling me this? Alice shrugged. Because William may think he's untouchable, but he's not. And if he's using you as part of whatever game he's playing, that means you have leverage too. Eva narrowed her eyes. What kind of leverage? Alice hesitated for a second before speaking. The board isn't happy with him. Eva's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Alice tapped her nails against the desk. James Wallace has been looking for any excuse to weaken William's hold on Carter Industries. The board has been patient, but William's push for restructuring and his recent projects that don't prioritize profit have made a few people nervous. Eva absorbed that information quickly. This was what William hadn't told her. While he had been busy controlling her world, his own world was beginning to fracture beneath him. For the first time since signing that damn contract, Eva felt like she had an opening. She straightened. So if I wanted to push back, now would be the time. Alice's lips twitched into a knowing smirk. Now would be the perfect time. Eva nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form in her mind. William thought he was the only one playing the game. It was time to prove him wrong. Eva didn't waste time. The moment Alice left, she pulled out her notebook and started listing every possible angle she could use. William had positioned himself as the undisputed power in their arrangement. But if what Alice said was true, then his grip on Carter Industries wasn't as secure as he wanted people to believe. And that changed everything. Her mind worked through the pieces like a puzzle. The board was growing uneasy, probably because William's recent investments had strayed from the high profit margins they were used to. He had already funded her project, which meant he was making decisions that weren't purely about financial gain. That alone was enough to make men like James Wallace start sharpening their knives. If she played this right, she could turn his own company against him. But she needed more information first. That night, as William returned to the penthouse, she was waiting for him. He barely looked at her as he loosened his tie, heading toward the bar. I assume you're still angry. Eva leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. Oh, furious. William poured himself a drink, smirking. And yet you're here, which means you want something. She tilted her head. I do. I want to know why the board is turning against you. That got his attention. His fingers paused against the rim of his glass, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Who told you that? Eva shrugged. Does it matter? William took a slow sip, measuring his response. I have everything under control. She let out a low laugh. Do you? Because from what I hear, the board isn't thrilled about your recent philanthropic endeavors. James Wallace is circling like a vulture, and I have a feeling it's only a matter of time before they try to push you out. William set his drink down with a soft but deliberate thud. Let me guess. You think this is your opportunity to fight back? Use this against me? Eva met his gaze, unflinching. I think this is my opportunity to remind you that you're not as untouchable as you think. Something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not amusement, but something sharper. Intrigue. He exhaled slowly, stepping toward her. And what exactly do you want, Eva? She held his stare. I want control over the South Loop project. Real control. I want full decision-making power. No interference from you, no backdoor acquisitions. If you're serious about keeping your company intact, you'll agree. A long silence stretched between them. Then, to her frustration, William smiled. Clever, he murmured, watching her like she was a particularly interesting opponent in a game of chess. You think you can back me into a corner? Eva lifted a brow. Aren't I? His smile deepened, but there was something dangerous behind it. You're getting good at this, Mrs. Carter. She ignored the way her pulse ticked at the way he said her name, keeping her focus sharp. I'll take that as a yes. William studied her for another long moment, then nodded once. Fine. The project is yours. Full control. No interference. Ava felt a small victory bloom in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had won this round. But something in William's gaze told her the game was far from over, and she had no doubt he was already planning his next move. Ava had barely been in control of the South Loop project for a week when she realized just how deep the opposition ran. The first sign of trouble came in the form of delayed permits, unexpected zoning issues, and a sudden withdrawal of key investors, all conveniently timed to stall progress. At first, she assumed it was just the usual bureaucratic red tape, but then she saw the name attached to most of the interference. James Wallace. Of course. She should have known he wouldn't sit back and watch William hand her control of something this important. James wasn't just a passive observer in Carter Industries. He was waiting for an opportunity to undermine William, and apparently, she had just become the easiest way to do it. She was the weak link, the unproven outsider. And James was using every tool at his disposal to make sure she failed. But he was about to learn something very important about her. She didn't break easily. Sitting in her office, she dialed the number William had given her for Richard Hale, Carter Industries' financial strategist, the same man who had been quietly feeding information to James. If James thought she didn't know about the cracks inside the company, he was about to find out how wrong he was. Richard picked up on the second ring, his voice smooth and rehearsed. Mrs. Carter, to what do I owe the pleasure? Eva didn't bother with pleasantries. Let's not waste time, Richard. I know you've been stalling permits, interfering with our investor meetings, and coordinating with James Wallace to sabotage the project. Now I have two options. I can bring this directly to William, or you can tell me exactly what you and James are planning. There was a brief pause. Then Richard let out a low, amused chuckle. You don't waste time, do you? No, Eva said flatly. And I don't play games either. Ah, he said smoothly. But you're married to a man who does. Her grip on the phone tightened. Don't test me, Richard. Silence stretched between them for a long moment before Richard finally sighed. All right, Mrs. Carter. Since you're being direct, I'll return the favor. James wants you to fail. That much is obvious. But what you don't know is that he's not just stalling your project. He's using it as a test case against William. Eva's stomach twisted. What do you mean? He's making a case to the board that William's leadership is unstable, that his personal decisions are interfering with the company's profitability. You and the South Loop project? You're Exhibit A. If you fail, it's proof that William's new vision is bad for business. Eva's pulse quickened. This was bigger than just her project. James was trying to take William down completely, and she had just been handed the perfect weapon to fight back. She exhaled slowly. Thanks for your honesty, Richard. He chuckled again. Don't thank me yet. You still have to win. She hung up, her mind racing. This wasn't just about South Loop anymore. This was war. Eva sat back in her chair, the weight of Richard Hale's words settling in her chest like a heavy stone. James Wallace wasn't just trying to block her project. He was making a move against William, using her as nothing more than a pawn in a much bigger play. If South Loop failed, it wouldn't just be her loss. It would be William's downfall. She should have felt a rush of satisfaction at the idea. After all, she had wanted to take him down herself. But something about the way James was maneuvering made her stomach twist. He didn't care about the ethics of business, about what was right or wrong. He wasn't trying to stop William because of some moral objection to corporate greed. He was doing it because he wanted power, the same way William always played to win. Only this time, William wasn't the one in control, and that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She exhaled, pushing away the conflicting emotions. This wasn't about William. This was about her project, her people, her cause, and she refused to let James use her as a weapon in his power struggle. Grabbing her phone, she made a series of calls, first to her legal team, then to a few key investors she had been working with before William came into the picture. If James thought she was going to crumble under his pressure, he was sorely mistaken. He had underestimated her, and by the time she was done, he was going to regret it. 2 days later, she walked into a boardroom filled with sharks in tailored suits, her posture straight, her confidence unwavering. Across the long table, James Wallace sat as calm and composed as ever, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he already knew how this meeting would play out. William was at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, but she knew him well enough now to recognize the underlying tension in his jaw, the slight tightening of his grip on his pen. He knew this was a trap, and so did she. But what James didn't know was that she had come prepared. The moment the meeting began, James wasted no time making his move. He stood, buttoning his jacket as he addressed the room with a voice that was smooth, authoritative, practiced. We need to discuss the growing concerns regarding our latest expansion projects, particularly the South Loop initiative. While I understand that some within our organization have been pushing for a more socially responsible approach to development, it's important to recognize that our primary objective has always been profitability. He turned slightly, his gaze settling on William with just enough challenge to be noticeable. Recent decisions have raised concerns among investors and board members about whether our company is still maintaining its core values. We have always been an organization that prioritizes growth, but we now find ourselves diverting valuable resources into projects with little financial return. Ava watched as a few board members nodded subtly, the undercurrent of agreement running through the room. James wasn't coming at this from a place of anger or personal bias. He was doing what he did best, making the numbers speak for him. And if she hadn't done her homework, he might have won right then and there. But she had done her homework. She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. That's an interesting perspective, Mr. Wallace, but it's also an incomplete one. James turned his attention to her, raising a brow as if amused by her attempt to challenge him. Is that so? She nodded, sliding a neatly prepared folder across the table. This is the latest financial forecast for the South Loop project, compiled not just by my team, but by external analysts. You'll see that while the immediate return on investment may not match the high margins of our luxury developments, the long-term benefits far outweigh the initial costs. She gestured toward a highlighted section of the report. In cities where mixed-income housing developments have been successfully implemented, property values have stabilized rather than declined, and businesses in those areas have seen a steady increase in revenue. The idea that social responsibility and profitability are mutually exclusive is outdated. The world is changing, and if Carter Industries refuses to change with it, we'll be the ones left behind. Silence stretched across the room. James flipped through the report, but Ava could see the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly against the edge of the paper. He hadn't expected her to come armed with data that could counter his argument so cleanly. A few seats down, one of the more neutral board members cleared his throat. These projections are interesting. He glanced at William. Have you reviewed this? William, who had been quietly watching the exchange, finally spoke. I have. He leaned back, his expression as unreadable as ever, but there was something subtly satisfied in the way he watched James struggle to pivot. And I believe Ava makes an excellent point. This company's strength has always been in its ability to evolve. Clinging to outdated models just because they've worked in the past isn't strategy. It's stagnation. James set down the file, his face betraying nothing, but Ava could feel the undercurrent of frustration beneath his polished demeanor. He wasn't going to win this round. Not today. The rest of the meeting continued with less resistance than expected, and by the time it was over, Eva knew she had successfully derailed James's attempt to turn the board against William. But she also knew something else. James Wallace wasn't the kind of man to take a loss lightly, and she had just painted a target on her back. As the board members began to leave, William finally turned to her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You just made an enemy out of James Wallace. She met his gaze without hesitation. So did you. William smirked, something almost like pride flickering in his eyes. I think I'm starting to enjoy having you around. Mrs. Carter Ava didn't let herself react to the warmth in his tone. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over, and something told her that James wasn't going to stay on the defensive for long. The fallout from the board meeting didn't take long to hit. Within 24 hours, Eva started noticing the subtle but deliberate retaliation orchestrated by James Wallace. It wasn't loud or obvious. James was too experienced for that. But it was there, in the sudden withdrawal of key investors, in the unexpected legal delays that stalled construction on the South Loop project, in the way several of her contacts in city planning suddenly stopped returning her calls. It was a message, sent without words, but clear in intent. She had won a battle, but James was still fighting the war. She expected resistance. What she hadn't expected was the relentlessness of it. Sitting in her office, staring at the latest denial from the zoning commission, she exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of her desk. She knew how these things worked. Someone had been pressured, influenced, bought, and she had a very good idea of who was behind it. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, recognizing the number. Alice. She answered immediately. Tell me you have something. Alice didn't bother with greetings. James is moving faster than I thought. He's working the board, undermining William wherever he can. And now he's making it look like you're the weak link. Eva clenched her jaw. Of course he is. I've heard whispers that he's meeting with Richard Hale tomorrow. If James is trying to flip the board, Richard is the one person who can tip the scales. Alice's voice lowered slightly. You need to get ahead of this, Ava. Fast. Eva rubbed her temple, frustration burning in her chest. I already knew James would come after me, but if he's trying to take William out at the same time, then this isn't just about the project anymore. Alice sighed. It never was. Eva closed her eyes for a brief second, calculating her next move. She had been so focused on protecting South Loop that she hadn't seen the full extent of the power play happening around her. James didn't just want to kill her project. He wanted William's throne. And if he succeeded, Eva wouldn't just lose South Loop. She would lose every ounce of leverage she had. She needed a counterattack. Something bigger. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Where's William? Alice hesitated. At the Carter Tower. I think he's expecting you. Of course he was. Without another word, Eva grabbed her coat and strode out of the office. It was time for a war council. The elevator ride up to William's office felt longer than usual, tension coiling in Ava's stomach as she prepared for the fight ahead. When the doors slid open, she stepped into the executive floor, striding past William's assistant without waiting to be announced. William was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, phone pressed to his ear, his expression tight with controlled frustration. He didn't acknowledge her immediately, continuing his conversation with clipped efficiency. "I don't care what they've been told. If the zoning permits are being delayed, I want names. Someone is pulling strings, and I want to know who." A pause, his jaw tensed. "Then make them talk." Eva crossed her arms, waiting. After a few more terse exchanges, William finally ended the call, turning to her with an assessing gaze. "I assume you're here about James." She exhaled sharply. "Your assumption would be correct." He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. "We have a problem," she said, cutting straight to the point. "James isn't just sabotaging my project. He's undermining you. And if we don't stop him now, he's going to take everything." William studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Tell me everything you know." Eva didn't waste time. She laid everything out. James's calculated moves, his manipulation of the board, the way he was systematically turning William's own people against him. She told him about Richard Hale's upcoming meeting with James, about the legal delays, about the investors who had suddenly started withdrawing their support from the South Loop project. William listened in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression unreadable. But she could see the way his jaw ticked slightly, the way his eyes darkened at each new revelation. When she finished, she crossed her arms. "He's making his move, William. And if we don't act fast, you're going to lose everything." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling a quiet laugh. It wasn't amused. It wasn't relaxed. It was the kind of laugh that sent a shiver down her spine, because it was laced with something sharp, something lethal. "James always was patient," he murmured, almost to himself. "I should have expected he'd play the long game." Eva frowned. "You knew this was coming?" "I knew he'd try something eventually," William admitted, rolling his wrist as if brushing off a minor inconvenience. "But I didn't expect him to use you to do it." His gaze flicked back to her, sharp and assessing. "That was his mistake." She narrowed her eyes. "And why is that?" A slow smirk tugged at his lips. "Because he underestimated you." Eva blinked, thrown by the unexpected compliment. But she didn't let herself dwell on it. "That doesn't change the fact that he's winning." William stood, moving toward the window, his posture completely at ease, as if they weren't discussing the possible collapse of his entire empire. "I wouldn't say that just yet," he mused, sliding his hands into his pockets. "James is smart, but he's predictable. He's overplayed his hand. And now we hit back." Eva exhaled, her mind already working through potential countermoves. "How?" William turned back to her, his expression sharper than she had ever seen it. This was the real William Carter, the one who thrived in boardrooms, who had built an empire with nothing but ruthless ambition and an unshakable ability to stay 3 steps ahead. "We cut him off at the knees." Eva arched a brow. "Care to elaborate?" William moved toward his desk, pulling open a drawer and retrieving a file. He tossed it onto the surface between them. "James has been siphoning funds through a series of shell companies. He's been diverting money from Carter Industries into private accounts, using backdoor deals to gain leverage over board members. Eva's eyes widened as she flipped through the documents. This was proof. Hard evidence. She looked up at him. "How long have you had this?" William smirked. "Long enough to know that James's little coup was coming." Ava's pulse quickened. "And you just sat on it?" He shrugged. It wasn't the right time to use it. She let out a short laugh of disbelief. "You really do love playing with fire, don't you?" His smirk widened slightly. "I prefer to let my enemies think they're winning. It makes the fall that much sweeter." She shook her head, trying to wrap her mind around how calculated he was. But she wasn't going to complain, not when this information gave them exactly what they needed. "This is enough to bury him," she murmured, scanning the documents again. William nodded. "Now the question is, how do we use it?" Eva's gaze lifted to his, and for the first time, she realized they were truly on the same side in this fight. A slow smile curved her lips. "We make sure James Wallace never recovers." William's smirk matched hers. "Now you're thinking like a Carter." Eva sat across from William in his private study, the dim lighting casting sharp shadows across his face as they pieced together the final steps of their plan. The documents he had handed her were a goldmine. Bank records, shell company transfers, confidential emails, all pointing to James Wallace funneling money out of Carter Industries into private investments. "This isn't just corruption," Eva murmured, flipping through the pages. "This is embezzlement. If we go public with this, James won't just lose his position. He could face criminal charges." William leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the armrest. "Exactly." His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it, a quiet, simmering satisfaction. "But we're not going straight to the authorities. Not yet." Eva narrowed her eyes. "Then what's the plan?" William smirked. "We make sure James loses everything in one move." He pulled out another file and slid it toward her. "I made a few calls. The board is still on the fence about whether they should back James or me. They don't care about loyalty, only who benefits them more. But if they think James is a liability—" Ava's eyes scanned the documents, her pulse quickening. "They'll turn on him." William nodded. "Tomorrow morning, we're calling for an emergency board meeting. We're going to present this evidence in front of every single member." Ava exhaled slowly, her mind working through the implications. "And if they still don't side with you?" William's smirk deepened. "Then we release the files to the press. One way or another, James is finished." A slow, satisfied smile crossed Ava's lips. She had fought battles before, had stood before city councils and business tycoons, arguing for the rights of the people they tried to ignore. But this was a war. And for the first time, she wasn't just fighting against a system, she was tearing it down from the inside. "Then let's end this," she said. William held her gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes before he nodded. "Tomorrow, James Wallace falls." The next morning, Carter Tower was unusually tense. The top-floor boardroom, normally a place of controlled negotiations and measured power plays, buzzed with an undercurrent of something heavier, more dangerous. The air itself felt charged, as if the entire building could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Eva and William walked in together, side by side, presenting a united front. She had never imagined herself being in this position, not just fighting in a corporate war, but standing next to William Carter, not as his opponent, but as his ally. James Wallace was already seated at the long, polished table, looking as confident as ever. He greeted them with a slow smirk, fingers tapping idly against the wood as if he were already victorious. "William, Eva, what a pleasant surprise." William didn't waste time. He placed a thick file in front of James, then tossed a second copy onto the table for the rest of the board members to see. "This is an audit of Carter Industries' financial transactions over the past 18 months. It includes records of unauthorized fund diversions, offshore accounts, and investments made using company assets without board approval." A murmur swept through the room. Some members immediately flipped through the documents, their expressions darkening. Others turned to James, waiting for his reaction. James barely spared the file a glance. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You've been busy, Will? Digging through old reports, chasing shadows?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "It's desperate, and frankly, disappointing." William's gaze remained steady. "The numbers don't lie, but you do." Eva watched James closely, noting the flicker of something behind his composed expression. Not panic, not yet, but something close. He hadn't expected them to have this much evidence. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair, cleared his throat. "Is this true, James?" James let out a low chuckle, reaching for his own copy of the file and flipping it open. "Let's not be dramatic. Business is about strategy, allocating resources wisely. Some of those funds were redirected to protect our long-term interests, investments that would have benefited the company if they had been given time to mature." He looked at the board, voice smooth, persuasive. "And let's not forget, under my financial leadership, Carter Industries has consistently outperformed projections for the past 5 years." Eva felt a spike of irritation. He was good. Too good. He wasn't denying the numbers. He was reframing them, spinning the truth just enough to cast doubt. And from the way some of the board members hesitated, she knew he was getting to them. But she had come prepared for this. She reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive, placing it on the table. "Since we're talking about strategy, I have something for you all to consider." She pressed a button on the conference room's control panel, and the large screen at the front of the room lit up. A series of emails, bank statements, and financial breakdowns appeared, each one detailing James's backdoor deals and personal transactions, funds siphoned into shell companies linked directly to him. Eva turned to face the board. "This isn't about strategy. It's about corruption. James has been using Carter Industries' resources to line his own pockets, and I have the paper trail to prove it." The room went dead silent. James's smirk finally faltered. William leaned forward, his voice cool and controlled. "I've already spoken to legal. If the board doesn't vote to remove you today, I'll be taking this directly to the SEC that did it." James's calm facade cracked. His eyes flicked to the board members, calculating, searching for an ally. But the shift in the room was palpable. No one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of a legal scandal. One by one, the board members looked away. Finally, the chairman spoke, his voice firm. "A vote for immediate removal is in order." Within minutes, James Wallace was done. By the time security escorted him out of the building, his carefully built empire had crumbled beneath him. And Eva? She had just proven to the entire room that she wasn't just William Carter's wife. She was a force to be reckoned with. As the meeting concluded, the remaining board members filed out, murmuring amongst themselves, while William stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching as James disappeared down the hallway for the last time. When they were finally alone, he turned to her, his smirk laced with something deeper, pride, amusement, and something else she couldn't quite name. Remind me never to get on your bad side, Mrs. Carter. Eva exhaled, the weight of everything hitting her all at once. You were already on my bad side, Carter. You just got lucky. His smirk deepened. Lucky, huh? She held his gaze, and for the first time since this all began, she wasn't sure which of them had truly won. The days after James Wallace's downfall were strangely quiet. The war was over, the empire was intact, and for the first time in weeks, there were no more battles left to fight. But as Ava sat in her office at the South Loop project site, staring out at the half-built development, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. She had won. The project was finally hers, completely, irrevocably hers, with no strings attached, no hidden agendas, no threats looming over her. And yet, instead of feeling relief, there was an odd weight in her chest, something unnamed and uneasy. She knew what it was, or rather, who. William. They hadn't spoken much since the board meeting. He had given her space, no smug remarks, no power plays, no carefully orchestrated moments to pull her back into his world. And for some reason, that bothered her more than it should. She had spent so much time fighting him, resisting him, proving that she wouldn't be another pawn in his game. But now that the game was over, what were they? The sharp knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. William stepped inside, his presence as effortless as ever. But there was something different about him tonight. Something more careful, more deliberate. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "You did it," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Ava exhaled, glancing back at the skyline. "So did you." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Then, finally, William sighed, stepping closer. "This was never just a deal for me." Ava's breath caught at his words. "This was never just a deal for me." She turned to face him, searching his expression for the usual smug confidence, the calculated charm. But there was none of that. Instead, she saw something real, something unmasked, and that terrified her more than anything. She swallowed. It was supposed to be. William exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe at the start, but somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as a condition of a contract and started—" He hesitated, as if the words were foreign to him, as if admitting this was more dangerous than any corporate battle he had ever fought. Ava felt her pulse pound in her ears. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not with him. Not with the man who had once been her enemy, her opponent, the person she had sworn she would never let get close. And yet, he had. He had wormed his way into her life, into her thoughts, into her damn heart. And now she had no idea how to separate herself from him. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "The contract ends soon." William's jaw tightened. "I know." "We could walk away," she continued, testing the words, testing herself. "We could end this like we planned." He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them. "Do you want to?" She should have said yes. She should have ended this before it became something more than she could handle. But instead, she whispered, "No." William exhaled sharply, as if he had been waiting for those words, hoping for them, fearing them all at once. And then he kissed her. Not like the first time, not like the carefully controlled display at their wedding. This kiss was raw, unguarded, completely real. It was a declaration, a confession, a promise of something neither of them had expected to find in each other. When they pulled apart, Eva's heart was racing, but she didn't step back. Neither did he. His fingers brushed against hers, tentative, as if this time he wasn't reaching for her out of necessity, but out of choice. "So what now?" she murmured. William smirked, but it was softer this time, almost hesitant. "We write our own terms." For the first time since this all began, Eva wasn't fighting him. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to.